Now is not a good time to start destroying a cardboard box, my dude. We're going to talk about some book superlatives for this last list video that I'm doing for the end of the year, because I've done a video for my worst books, I've done a video for my best books, and frankly I just feel like some of the other adjectives need some love. And I've read a lot of books this year and some of the other books need some love, so we're just going to smush that together. And I've got a list of 10 books for 10 different superlatives. So let's go. My first superlative is the funniest book. This was a hard one to choose, but the funniest book I read this year was Inconsiderable by Kevin Hearn. Didn't think I remembered that name, but I did. This is about Al, who has a very Scottish name that I mess up every time because I'm not hearing it, I'm reading it, and therefore can't remember how to pronounce it, who is a sigillist working in Glasgow. He uses his sigil magic to write up contracts and is therefore involved with the Fae and real life, and it's a whole thing in this world. And he is an old man with a fabulous moustache, but his apprentices keep dying and it's become a bit of a problem. And then he meets a pink hobgoblin who names himself Buckfoy, which is a spoonerism. Yep. And multiple shenanigans ensue. It is very, very fucking funny, is what I will say. There's lots of irreverent humour, but that doesn't mean it's not also a little bit heartbreaking when we touch on some of like the bigger storylines. This is a series. I've read the second one in the series, and I believe the third one is either just come out or is coming out early next year. Can't remember off the top of my head. But if you like funny, irreverent urban fantasy following a character that's not in their 20s, then this is the book for you, and I highly recommend it. Inconsiderable by Kevin Hearn. Next up, I've got the vibiest book. Now for me, vibiest means the good vibes in my head that make the little part of my brain that reads fantasy go ding. I can't really explain it further than that because it's just a little part of the back of my head that goes ding when I read certain things. Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia of Fairies did that for me. This wasn't exactly what I wanted from this book. I was very excited when this book came out because fairies and cozy and sort of low stakes mystery kind of deal. Why wouldn't I like it? But the only reason I didn't love it as much as I thought I would is because I had already decided what I thought I wanted the book to be in my head before I read it, which is never a good way to go into a book. But the vibes in this book are immaculate. If you want to see fairies done well and done right, this is how you do it. If you want to see how fairies can be intertwined into village life, this is how you do it. If you want to see how relationships can be very human and very funny and very realistic, this is how you do it. So for me, the vibes in this book were on point. I am always looking for books that give me the same vibes as I got when I read the Spiderwick Chronicles for the first time. This book got really, really close. So if you're a Spiderwick fan, you'll want to read this book. If you haven't already, because it's already super popular. So lots of people have read it, and as you should have. Well done, Godstar. On the back of that, my next one is the most magical book I read this year, which I am giving to Spinning Silver by Naomi Novik. This is kind of 3 fairy tales rolled into one. It follows 3 main characters, but I can only remember one of them off the top of my head because I get confused about whose story is which. We follow the daughter of a moneylender in a small village. They're a Jewish family, and the dad, who is the moneylender, is shit at his job. And his daughter takes over and revels in the concept of compound interest. And naturally, fairies then think she is turning silver into gold. Because why wouldn't you? And then the Fae get involved, and there is another, I think she's a princess. She's either a princess or a noblewoman's daughter or someone like that. She's rich and she's young and her father's trying to marry her off. But the person she's being married off to is not a very nice person. And their stories intertwine, as well as another girl's story who intertwines with the first girl. And it's all very magical. It feels like you're reading a brand new fairy tale, but it takes the best parts of like fairy tale tropes and just rolls them out in new ways that you hadn't thought of, with clever tricks and bargains and really clever, resourceful female protagonists, and it's just so well written. It's also set in pseudo-Eastern Europe, which is cool because I don't often read books in that setting. So that is the most magical book I think I've read this year, and I highly recommend it. The prettiest book. I did have to have a think about this. The book that stuck in my mind was God Killer by Hannah Kaner. I mean, look at it. Look at it and tell me you have read a prettier book than this year. Yeah? Look at it. Have you read a prettier book than this year? No. So it's my prettiest book of the year. It's also a good story. I would recommend the story. It's about a god killer if you couldn't work that one out from the title. But yeah, that's my prettiest book. My most baffling book of the year is The Mask of Mirrors by M.A. Carrick. I have spoken about this book a few times because I love the first one and DNF the second one in the series, for the reason that it was very baffling. It was just so confusing because why would you give your characters 4 different names and 2 different titles and various statuses that we all have to keep track of in an alphabet I'm not familiar with, and then have various characters refer to them by various names, and then swap those around, and then give your main character 4 different aliases that she uses with various characters, and she method acts where she is that character and she doesn't reference the other ones as she's in. It's so confusing. The story in the first book was good. I didn't feel like it needed a second book. But I'll be honest, I didn't really understand how the first book ended, hence baffling. So maybe I'm wrong on that front. It is well written. It's just so confusing, and I don't know how they came up with this story, because M.A. Carrick is a combination of 2 authors, one of who is Marie Brennan, who wrote The Natural History of Dragons. I don't remember who the other author is, but I can't comprehend one person coming up with a plot this confusing, let alone 2 people working together to come up with a plot that confusing. Maybe that's just me and I don't know how to play well with others, but that baffles me as well. So that was my most baffling book of this year. My most disappointing book of the year was Babel by R.F. Kuang. I hated this book. It's not on my worst books of the year, only because there were 5 other books that I hated more. Babel, which I want to say Babel because that's how I've always pronounced it. I enjoyed the conversation about etymology and words and how we use words. That was cool. The rest of the story was shit. It was poorly thought out, the characters were wishy-washy, the motivations were boring and uninspired, it was predictable, it was bad. It was bad. The shit plot was just a vessel for some very valid points, but because they were in the vessel of a shit plot, I hated the book. I hated the characters. I really, really did. I disliked them thoroughly. It was not for me. I would have preferred to have read a textbook, frankly, about the horrors of colonialism, because that's what it's about. And racism and xenophobia and all of that. Those are important topics. They are. I just didn't like the way that they were delivered to me in this stupidly long book that didn't need to be that long either. So that was my most disappointing, because it was so fucking hyped up as well. Everyone was talking about it. So done. Fine. The longest book I read this year was Assassin's Quest by Robin Hobb. This was a reread because I have read all of it Around with the Elderlings, but I wanted to scratch that itch in my brain that I got when I first read them, and I didn't get it rereading them this time around. I filmed the video about it and then deleted it because it was so incoherent and sweary. Because I have very different opinions about the characters in these books now that I have reread them, and I couldn't continue with the series. I read the first trilogy and I suffered through that last book. I can't actually remember whether Assassin's Quest, I don't know which one in the series that is because they all have such similar names, but it was stupidly long. It's like 800 and something stupid pages. I listened to it on audiobook. Characters are all bastards. They all want fits for something. It's all cupboard love. It's all Verity's a villain and you can't convince me otherwise now. Yeah, I hated it. It was fucking miserable. And the last book was so much fucking longer than it needed to be. And I think that is this book. I think this is this last book. It didn't need to be 800 fucking pages long. It didn't. You could have cut out 75% of his depression funk, which was just rehashing the same thing over and over again, and him being an idiot when he didn't need to be an idiot. We already knew he was an idiot. You spent the first half of the book explaining that. We didn't need... I'm going to stop. I didn't enjoy it, but it was the longest book I read this year. The shortest book I read was The Lost Sisters by Holly Black. This is an accompanying novella to the Cruel Prince series, The Lost Sisters being Jude and the other one. Taryn? Jude and Taryn. It's only 50 pages long. I read it as an ebook. It took me like half a minute to read. It didn't really add anything to the story. You don't need to read it. I feel like it was probably like a bonus add-on for a competition or something like that, but that was the shortest thing I read this year. Didn't love it. The grossest book I read this year was Radium Girls by Kate Moore. Yes, I think that's her name. This is the story of the Radium Girls, the girls that worked in radium factories when radium was first discovered, painting clock dials and dials on like military equipment so that they would glow in the dark. And it talks about the boom of the radium industry when people thought it was a benefit to their beauty and their health to take radium and to paint it on themselves to go out into like glow in the dark parties and shit like that. This is the grossest book I read because, spoiler alert, radium's very fucking bad for you. And the reason this book is so gross is because radium painters were strongly encouraged to lick the tip of their paintbrush to make it pointier so they could get neater lines and like smaller lines when they were painting. So naturally they ingested a lot of radium, and this book follows their story of how they all developed cancer and abscesses, and their bones would just crumble inside their mouths, their jaws would come away. It was absolutely vile reading it, partly because you know it's a real story, but also no one really enjoys hearing about people's jaws just coming away or hair coming out in clumps and like just their bodies deteriorating. And for ages, no one could pin it on the radium. No one realised that was what it was. And then after that, the fight to get the factory bosses to not necessarily listen to them because they kind of already knew that the radium was doing that. That's the whole part of the story. But to get justice for the fact that these radium factory bosses knew that's what was happening to these women, and they would just dismiss them, they would ignore their complaints, and they would just keep hiring new women who wanted these really well-paid jobs as dial painters. And it was gross. It was gross because of the body horror. It was also gross because of the fucking detestable behaviour of these men, because it was all men in power who just wanted money. That was disgusting. Hated it. Hated it so much. Loved the book. Hated them. This book made me so fucking angry. So angry. I would recommend it if you've got the stomach for that kind of read. And then lastly, the queerest book I read all year in 2023 was Silver Under Nightfall. If you have read this book, you understand. This is Castlevania fanfiction, basically. This is just Castlevania fanfiction, but it is done well. The characters are lovable, very queer, and polyamorous as well. I think this might have been the only polyamory rep that I read all year, which was eye-opening, but it was very good. I really enjoyed it. I'm really looking forward to the next book. If you don't know what Castlevania is about, think vampires, like Dracula vampires in Eastern Europe, doing their thing, being bad, and then people hunting them down and stopping them. Watch the show if you want, it's a good show. Those were all my superlatives for 2023. Thank you very much for watching. Have a happy new year, and all the rest of that nonsense that people say at this time of year.